Hey guys, so the first thing I have to say, I just realized my mistake. I made a mistake. Surprise, surprise. Teachers make mistakes too. Um, I said that Susan B. Anthony sewed the first American flag, but that is not true. For some reason, I'm confusing these two women in my head, or I was yesterday. Betsy Ross actually sewed the first American flag, not Susan B. Anthony. So for some reason, I had it stuck in my head that it was her, but it was not. So Susan B. Anthony, of course, is one of our advocates for woman suffrage and women's rights in the early 19th century. So, or the mid to late 18th century. So now that we have that amended and cleared up, I'm sorry, Betsy Ross and Susan B. Anthony. Just to review a little bit, some of our important women that we discussed yesterday, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Remember, she gave the speech in the New York meeting that really stood out to thousands of women around the nation and said that women and men were created equal, not only men. She kind of became the leader. She started the more feisty of the two early women's groups, and then there was another women's group that was led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe that was a little bit more subtle. Eventually, they joined together to create the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. Carrie Chapman Catt was the president of that. And Susan B. Anthony, of course, yesterday we read about her going on trial for casting an illegal ballot in the 1872 election when she insisted that she and a few other women be allowed to vote. She told the judge at her sentencing that she would not be paying a single cent of her $100 fine. And so that is where we left off yesterday. So we're going to read a little bit more and see where these women take us. Okay, so we know that during all this, when all of this is happening, we're still settling the West, right? So we've talked about the Homestead Acts. We've talked about moving west of the Mississippi River, relocating the Native American tribes, settling Kansas, Nebraska, the creation of Colorado. And so the women are not only trying to win their right to vote in the West, but also in the East. Out west, far from Washington, D.C., the suffrage campaign achieved its first successes. In the West, the line separating women's and men's spheres was less clearly defined than in other parts of the nation. So that means if you're a homesteader, remember we said that everyone in the family was going to have to help with that. They didn't have enough resources for the men to be able to do everything on their own and the women to just stay home. So that meant that a lot of women were working hard at home. They might be helping out in the fields. They were also caring for the kids. And so those typical roles that we were accustomed to at the time were more crossed. There was more of a gray area, and the women were seen more as equals and more capable out west because they were able to have the opportunity to show that they were just as strong and capable as men were. On farms and homesteads, women joined their husbands in the hard work of planting, harvesting, tending animals, and more. If they could share work with men, why shouldn't they share the right to vote as well? In the mountainous parts of the West, there were relatively few women. Hoping to attract more female settlers, the territory of Wyoming established full voting rights for women in 1869. So there's our first full voting rights. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory. So remember, those mountainous regions over there in the Rockies didn't have as many women as some of the other parts And so one of the ways that they were encouraging women to come out that way and families to come out that way was by securing their right to vote in the state of Wyoming. The Utah and Washington territories followed, and by 1893, women in Colorado could vote as well. So now we've got from 1869 to 1893. That's kind of a lot of years. If you can do that math and find out what the difference between those 2 years is, how many years was that between 1869 and 1893? Remember, you're finding the difference. If you can find that difference, please do so and leave your answer in the comments. So by 1893, women have the right to vote in the Wyoming Territory as well as Utah. Utah, Washington. Now this is not Washington, D.C. This is what is now Washington State. All the way over by California in the northwest, and Colorado. So those were some of their first successes. Western women soon started running for public office, winning numerous local elections. So this isn't running for president. This might be running for a seat in your local town. So we have town elections too. Some things that we vote for and elect offices in our town would be the sheriff, the mayor. We elect representatives, we elect treasurers, those kind of things. And so those local offices that were elected, some women had started running for those, and they were being voted in and elected. In 1916, Montana voters elected Jeanette Rankin to the U.S. House of Representatives, where she became the first woman in Congress. 1916, first woman in Congress. So she is elected to be one of those representatives that have a seat in Congress, and that was a big deal. So that's not just for her state. She's a representative for her state, but it's at the national level. So she's actually getting to say her piece in Congress. Let's see, her name was Jeanette Rankin, and she was from Montana. All right, as more women joined the workforce and attended college, more of them joined the ranks of state and local suffrage groups. So that means as they're getting out, they're going to college, they're experiencing that workforce, more of them are joining those local groups in their cities or their states of the women who are actually doing the fighting for women's suffrage. With new energy, new ideas, and the organizational experience gained as members of women's clubs and voluntary organizations, the rising generation of suffragists went to work. So now we've got new ideas in there. We have new people who are wanting to help and who have ideas on how we can do this. And I've got a picture here from 1910, and these are women who are college educated. They're wearing their robes representing the college they've attended, and they are marching for their right to vote, showing that they are educated. And why should they not be allowed to vote just as a man? And I will be putting this picture in your content library now that everyone, I think, once you've logged on everybody is able to see that now, so I will start putting more resources in there for you. By 1912, women won state-level suffrage campaigns in Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona. So, we can add California to our list, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona. But I want you to notice that these states are all still out west, west of the Mississippi. Suffragists employed new tactics. They canvassed door to door, held nighttime torchlight parades, and spoke to crowds at suburban streetcar shops. Who remembers what suburban means? I know in the lower elementary group we've talked about it a little bit. We had rural, which means out in the country. We have urban, which is inside the big city, and suburban is kind of those smaller towns and cities that are right outside the urban area. In 1913, the suffragists achieved a major breakthrough when Illinois women won the right to vote, though only in presidential elections. So in 1913, they win Illinois. Now, Illinois is not one of those western states, is it? However, they didn't give their women yet the right to vote in state and local elections, only for the President of the United States. Despite the limitation of Illinois' new law, for the first time, women's rights activists had won a political victory in a state east of the Mississippi River. So there's another big win for us women. Arguments for women's suffrage varied widely. Far from attacking the idea of separate spheres for men and women, many suffragists supported it. They insisted that now more than ever, women needed the right to vote to enhance their ability to be good wives and mothers. They argued that in the new industrialized landscape of modern America, women needed to be politically active in order to be responsible caretakers of the home. Jane Addams adopted this line of reasoning in her 1910 essay, Why Women Should Vote. She wrote, "In a crowded city quarter, in the street is not cleaned by the city authorities, no amount of private sweeping will keep the tenement free from grime. If the garbage is not properly collected and destroyed, a tenement house mother may see her children sicken and die of disease. Other dangers, such as improperly inspected food, could threaten the home, while saloons could compromise urban neighborhoods. Such problems," said Addams, "required political remedies. Thus, unless women had some control over the politicians, they could not properly execute their responsibilities as mother and wives. To fulfill her traditional responsibility to her children," Addams concluded, "a woman must bring herself to the use of the ballot." So what she's saying is that women, wives and mothers, are seeing different problems than what men who are going to work might see. So a woman's vote might be for something a little bit different than what a man's vote might be for. So she mentioned having dirty streets and not having appropriate trash pickup, and that it's making the kids sick. And that might be something that the fathers, the husbands, might not see. If they're at work, they might not see what their children are playing with. They may not see what goes on around those areas during the day. So she's saying that to do her best job as a wife and mother, she needs to have some say in who is running the show. Suffragists disagreed on strategy and tactics. Unhappy with the gradual state-by-state focus of the NAWSA, in 1913, a group of activists led by Alice Paul, a young Quaker from New Jersey, founded the Congressional Union for Woman Suffrage, later called the National Woman's Party. Paul had recently returned from England, where she took part in a radical woman suffrage movement led by Emmeline Pankhurst, whose motto was "Deeds, not words." Pankhurst and her colleagues held hunger strikes, pelted politicians with eggs, and broke into meetings of Parliament, which would be the government in Great Britain. Under Alice Paul's leadership, the National Woman's Party called for a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. So here we've got Alice Paul, and she definitely seems like she had had enough of how long this was taking. And so she said, no, we are not going to go at the state level. We're going to go for a constitutional change, a constitutional amendment stating that women can vote in any election anywhere in our country. Here we've got a map. It's state by state woman suffrage before the 19th Amendment in 1920. And the red is equal suffrage. Yellow is partial suffrage, meaning, like, for example, in Illinois, they could vote for the president, but they couldn't vote for anything else. And no statewide suffrage. So you can see Tennessee, where we live, but before 1920, we were partial. All of our western states over here have full woman suffrage. They can vote for whatever they want to vote for. And the green has nothing. So they used a militant approach, but they were not violent. So even though they used more of a, let's call it, intimidating approach, they were not violent about it. So they weren't going through the streets and rioting and burning buildings and all those things. They weren't fighting, but they were a bit intimidating. When Paul led a picket line in front of the White House, she and her fellow marchers were assaulted by bystanders, beaten by the police, and hauled off to jail. In the cold and filthy prison, Paul and other suffragists staged a hunger strike, which the jailers tried to end through brutal force feeding. When the press published accounts of the mistreatment of the suffragists, Paul and the others were released, and the publicity won new support for the cause of woman suffrage. So they had a terrible experience. They were picketing, which basically means when you see people, a group of people, and they're holding their signs and they're chanting something or stating something that they want to happen. I'm sure in the news you guys have seen some of that happening in the last couple of years in our own country as well. Well, this was in our country too, but in our modern country. And so they were picketing, and they were picketing outside the White House, hoping to appeal to the president and national officials to give women the right to vote throughout the whole country. And they ended up being attacked by people who didn't support their cause. So they were attacked by just regular citizens. They were also beaten by the police. They were arrested, and while they were in jail, they decided, okay, we're going to starve until you give us what we want. We're not going to eat. And so, of course, they didn't want all these women dying in their prison, so they tried to force feed them, which didn't work. And eventually, word got out of what was happening, and it was made public, and so they were let go. But their dedication to this fight that they felt was so important really appealed to a lot of other people to help join their cause. All right, here we are, the 19th Amendment. This is the really exciting part, ladies and gentlemen. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. 19th. By the autumn of 1916, it was clear that the women's suffrage movement was gaining ground. After 10,000 women marched in front of the Republican Party's National Convention in Chicago, the party officially endorsed suffrage, but said each state should decide for itself. The Democrats promptly did the same. So in our government elections, we have two main parties. We have the Democrats and the Republicans. Over the years, their viewpoints have changed and changed back and changed again. And at the time, the women decided to march outside of the Republicans' convention, and they won them over. So the Republican Party says, okay, if we are in office, if the Republican becomes a president, we will support women's suffrage. But it will not be national. It will be left to the state government to decide. The Democratic Party jumped on board with that, and they did the same thing. Suffragists were also gaining support for a proposed constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. With tens of thousands of women contributing to the World War I home front effort, it became increasingly difficult to justify denying women the franchise. We are going to get into World War I by the end of this week, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about what's happening there, but it says women are having their war effort on the home front, meaning in our country. So what that basically means is that women were putting in a lot of work and effort to support our troops who were away fighting in World War I. And so that kind of gained them a lot of respect as well. And we'll talk more about what that looked like when we get into World War I. In early 1918, President Woodrow Wilson reversed his earlier opposition to women's suffrage and endorsed the amendment. So in 1918, Woodrow Wilson is president, and he used to be against this act. But then he decided, you've got a good point, I'm on your side. And so he endorsed their petition to create an amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote nationally. After a spirited debate in Congress, the House passed the measure, but the Senate voted it down. So it's gotten the president's on board, Congress is on board. Well, the House of Representatives is on board, but the Senate was not. A year later, however, after further effort by suffrage activists, Congress passed the 19th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. So now all the states have to agree with it. So we've got, or a majority of the states have to agree with it. So we've got first the President Wilson, says, yes, let's go forward with this amendment. Our House of Representatives, who is part of Congress, the Senate is the other part of Congress, and the House of Representatives are on board with it, but the Senate is not, so it can't go any further at that time. Later, however, all of Congress did approve it and vote for it, so now it's been through what it needs to go through, but it has to be ratified by the states. By the late summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified the proposed amendment. One more state was needed to turn the amendment into a law. So 35 states had ratified the amendment. It needed one more state to turn it into a law. How many states then were required to pass this into a law? Leave your answer in the comments. Of the 13 state legislators that had not voted on ratification, only Tennessee seemed remotely possible. So what that means, Tennessee had not voted for it yet. So Tennessee was undecided, they hadn't voted yet. But out of all of the 13 states that were left, they felt like Tennessee was the most likely to give them that one last vote they needed. At the state capitol in Nashville, activists from both sides arrived in droves. In the end, it came down to the vote of a single state legislator, 24-year-old Harry Byrne. He had intended to vote no, but his mother sent a telegram urging him to help Mrs. Catt. He did, and on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, became the law of the land. So thank you, Mr. Harry Byrne's mother, because that was a close no. So Tennessee became the last state needed to ratify our 19th Amendment, giving women, American women, the right to vote in all state, local, and national elections. Congratulations, women. In 1920, we finally got the right to vote. It's a very long time. Who remembers when the African Americans were given the right to vote? If you remember what year, please leave it in the comments. And then see if you can figure out how many years later before women were allowed to vote. All right, guys, I'll see you tomorrow. Oh, and make sure if you have not logged in yet to your Microsoft Office, you need to do that today. I am hoping to set up some practice video calls with you guys hopefully on Thursday. So that gives you today and tomorrow to get it logged in and set up. Once you log in the first time, it does take a few hours before you might be able to see the documents that I've shared with you. So if you log in and right away doesn't pop up immediately, check back in a little while and see if you have. There is a challenge question for you under getting started in the collaboration section of your notebook. So I urge you to go on there and try to answer that. And I think that's about it. So I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.